website, but also on Facebook. How many of you saw my message this morning about that we're starting Mark? Okay, I want to encourage you to join our Facebook page because we can, and we're going to do better at that. Saran's going to help me, right? And
I just said to Happy, we have to do better this year.
we've got to do better, right? Anyway, so we're starting for those of you who are new, what we do is we teach through a book of the Bible. And it's a methodology that I've used for 30 years. And I like it. And I'm becoming more convinced that I like it by doing it in this church than I've ever done. Than I've ever felt. So we're going to be studying the Gospel of Mark from today through Easter Sunday. So Easter Sunday will be conveniently the resurrection to end Mark's Gospel, right? And so like I always do, I want to encourage you, start reading the Gospel of Mark. It's only 16 chapters. Whatever you do in your Bible reading, just add reading one chapter a day from Mark, and you will be far more prepared when I speak on Mark because you will have been reading him or it. Okay? And if you don't do Bible reading, then what a great opportunity. Start now. Read one or two chapters a day. And you'll be better prepared to ask questions, because those of you who know, we have question and answer and discussion time, and you'll be better equipped. So I'm going to approach the study of Mark a little bit differently, and I want to explain why. I'm going to do an introduction to the Gospel of Mark this morning. So I apologize if you're here to hear good preaching and somebody reach into your soul. That's what worship did. This is going to be a little bit more academic. It's going to be a little more historical in nature. And some of you are going to hear things you've never heard before. Just don't worry about it. Been telling the congregation, I give you a lot of stuff that probably you've never heard before, and you don't need to worry about trying to take diligent notes. You're going to hear things in the Gospel of Mark that are going to remind you of things that I mentioned when we studied the book of Acts and the letter to the Hebrews. So you slowly build an historic scaffolding of the first century church. As an early Christian historian, it's extremely important for me to read the ancient documents as if I'm the original hearer. Okay? Now that's impossible because I'm not. I'm living in this century, 2,000 years separated. But as an historian, for me to understand what the original writer is intending to say, it's really hard, but it's important to try my best to read the document and understand what the original hearers were hearing. And I'm going to try to do this for you in an introduction this morning, because I think it helps us understand better what Mark is trying to tell us in his gospel. Almost all scholars believe that Mark's gospel was the first one to take written form. I'm completely convinced that that's true. Almost all scholars believe that. It's a shorter gospel. It makes far more sense that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark in front of them and amplified it than it would that Mark had a copy of Matthew or Luke in front of him and shortened it. And that is a big part of the logic that scholars use. But it's very clear when you read Matthew and Luke that it's very clear when you read Matthew and Luke that they had a copy of Mark in front of them. Because there are major sections in both Matthew and Luke that are almost word for word what Mark says. And that's why we call them the synoptic gospels, the three gospels. Because they have content that is almost identical between the three of them. Okay? And Luke says in his introduction, many have attempted to record these things. I have done my best to study, and I'm going to collect this information and write a better account. He says that in the introduction. And so most scholars believe that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark in front of them, and then they amplified him. There are numerous places where it's word for word, yet there are other places where it's clear. There are other places where it's clear that Mark doesn't have their writings in front of him, because Matthew and Luke are almost in verbal agreement on segments of the teachings of Jesus that Mark doesn't have at all. And so we deduce these things. Now, some of you are wondering, what difference does it make? Okay, hold on. I'm going to try to help you understand that. That's part of how I see myself here, is trying to help you understand these things. Most of which for 25 years I didn't know. As a Christian sitting in the pew, I knew none of this. When I started doing my academic work, I started thinking, why have I not heard this? Why have I sat in church over hundreds of Sundays and heard thousands of sermons, and I have never heard some of this, and I didn't like that. I kind of didn't take that well. So I'm committed to help you learn and grow with your mind, right? We should love God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind. So I want you to turn your intellect on and listen and grasp. I was in a church one time where the pastor said, if you come here, check your brain at the door. And I looked around and thought, oh my gosh. I waited because they all knew me. I was a visitor that day. I wasn't speaking that day, but people knew me. It was a big church. And I waited for a pause in the action, and then I slipped out. And I never went back there. I'm not going to check my brain at the door, nor should you. God created us to think. So we need to use the greatest computer on the planet ever, and that's the human brain. None of that was in my notes, so here I am, not sticking to my notes, Jim. Okay. Mark's account has a greater percentage of the actions of Jesus rather than his teachings. For example, I made a mention ago that Luke and Matthew have segments about Jesus that Mark does not have. Not almost all of them, but a great percentage of those are his teachings. For example, the Sermon on the Mount. Wouldn't we agree the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' greatest recorded teaching? It's not in Mark. It's in Matthew and Luke, not in Mark. How could he miss that? We believe that Matthew and Luke had another document that we don't have anymore that contained the teachings of Jesus, and Mark's gospel is early enough, for some reason he didn't have that document. So the Sermon on the Mount, for example, is missing. Mark is filled with quick, short events. The text is written to keep the reader moving. I have in my notes more than 80% of his statements, and for some reason I doubt that number, and of course I haven't had the chance to go and verify it, but a large percentage of Mark's statements begin with the word and I'm going to illustrate it for you in just a minute. It's a literary device in the first century that was used to keep the reader moving. And a lot of his statements begin with and immediately. And unfortunately, we're missing that in our English translations. Anyone who knows me, I've read Greek for, 25 years. Anyone who knows me knows that I think our English translations are good. I don't care which one it is. They're all good. Men and women who know Greek better than I do, I trust them, and they're good. However, they're not perfect, and I'm going to illustrate that for you because I have a point to make. I'm going to read verses 9 through 13 from the translation that I tend to use, the NIV, although I also like other translations. Sometimes I use different ones. So this is verses 9 through 13, and I have highlighted, if you can put it up there, I've highlighted in bold because I want you to see that the NIV does capture some of what I just told you. Okay? At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." At once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. So in 5 verses, the NIV records 5 times the writer Mark using the word "and," or the Greek word "kai." All right? Now what I did is I took the Amplified version and I opened my Greek text and I superimposed the Greek on the Amplified, because even the Amplified doesn't do literal word for word. It's impossible. How many of you speak another language? Okay, I know Tony and Jose do. I do. Anyone else speak a second language? Anyone who speaks more than one language can tell you you cannot translate from one language to another literally. It's impossible. I don't care what languages it is. So Greek is the same way. But I want to illustrate to you, so I took the Greek and superimposed it on the Amplified version. Is that up? Let's put that up. And again, I have highlighted in bold. And I apologize, we're going to be fixing this, I'm told. The screen issue. I forgot about that, or I would have shoved the text lower. Alright, so here we go. Verse 9, same verses. And in those days Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And immediately he came up out of the water, and he saw the heavens torn open, and the Spirit like a dove coming down into him. And there came a voice from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." And he stayed in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered to him. So in the Greek, in the NIV, it has 5 ands. In the original Greek, it has 9 ands in this 5-verse section. So what difference does that make, Al? It's a literary device that Mark uses to get the reader to read. He doesn't want the reader to get, I hate to use this word because it feels like a more modern construct, but he doesn't want the reader to get bored. He wants the reader to keep going. He is presenting Jesus as a man of action. Okay? Very little of Jesus' teachings are found in Mark compared to Matthew and Luke, because Mark is using a literary device similar to, about 100 years prior to Mark, someone wrote the life of Julius Caesar. And that's how the life of a Roman emperor would be written. It would be filled with action. And it would use this literary device, and immediately, to keep the reader. It's like watching a Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movie. It's action, man. It's just constant action. Well, that's how I view it. I mean, look at how, and we didn't read it, but chapter 1, what we call chapter 1 of Mark, contains 12 verses cover the John the Baptist story through his death. Then Jesus is baptized. Then he gives the initial call of the disciples. Then he teaches in the synagogue, although Mark doesn't tell us anything about his teaching. Then Jesus casts out a demon from a man. Then he heals Peter's mother. Then he heals a bunch of other people. Then he casts out some more demons. Then he gets up early to pray. And then he heals a man with leprosy. That's all in chapter 1. What we call chapter 1. 45 verses, all of that action. And that's the point I'm making with the "and," telling you about the "and." Mark is presenting Jesus, a mighty man of power, who heals the sick, who casts out demons, who challenges the Jewish leaders, who was tormented, crucified, dead, and buried, and he's the Son of Man from Daniel's vision. Some of you are familiar with the Old Testament. Daniel is a prophet in the Old Testament, and he presents the Son of Man. And if you look, and I've done a study on this, I did an extensive paper on the Trinity, the development of the Trinity in Christian thought, and I have a chart that shows the instances of how each gospel writer refers to Jesus. And Mark is unique in that he calls Jesus the Son of Man more than any of the other gospel writers, more than Paul, more than anybody. He quotes every chapter from the book of Daniel. Isn't that interesting? Where Matthew quotes Isaiah all the time, Mark quotes Daniel all the time. And Jesus is presented as the Son of Man. The Son of Man, and from Daniel, is, and if anybody saw the Facebook post, I used a graphic of what's supposed to be a warrior coming on the clouds on a white horse. I think the one I used, the guy had a bow, the rider had a bow. Most of them he's carrying a sword. But that's the vision of the Son of Man in Daniel. It's Jesus coming back, or it's not Jesus, because Daniel doesn't know Jesus, but it's the Messiah figure as a Son of Man coming back to wage war against the enemies of God. And he has a horde of angels and hosts behind him, and they're coming to do battle. They're not coming to be nice. I mean, and we get that in the book of Revelation. They're killing people. It's a war, man. It's a war. And that is the vision that Mark is captured by, and that's what he's presenting. Now, I do believe that part of why Mark is doing that is that his main audience are Romans. Remember, he uses the literary technique that the life of Julius Caesar takes. He's trying to present to the Romans this Son of God, this Jew who was raised from the dead. And to get them to the resurrection, he's showing them this mighty man of power, that he's not afraid. And I'm going to talk more about this next week in chapter 1, but I'm going to give you a little hint right now. In Mark's presentation of Jesus, Jesus consistently has a sternness, an anger, a tiny tinge of anger comes through Jesus in Mark. Matthew and Luke kind of polish that out a little bit. But Mark doesn't. For Mark, it's the Son of Man coming on the clouds, and he's not coming to be happy. He's coming to wage war against the enemies of God. Now, somebody tell me who Mark is thinking about when he talks about the enemies of God. Can anybody tell me? The Romans. The Romans. Now, he contends openly with the Pharisees, and you could argue that they're his enemy, but when this harkens back to my teachings from the book of Acts, and I'll go into this more next week. The Jews are sick and tired of having people lord over them. Some of you who took the church history class I did remember the struggle that led to the Maccabean War before, about 100 years before Jesus, where the Seleucid Empire came and tried to force Greek culture on the Jews. And Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. Jesus refers to it as the abomination that leads to desolation. We read that when Jesus says that, and we're thinking in the future. Jesus is talking about something that happened 100 years before him. Kind of like we remember, people my age remember Pearl Harbor. I grew up hearing about Pearl Harbor. When 9/11 hit, now this generation, 9/11 is a signal moment. And that's what it was like for the Jews. They lived under this idea that we're being buffeted by these foreign governments. We have to pay them taxes. We hate them. They have no right to be in our land. And the Romans were in their land. Had Roman soldiers in Jerusalem. They despised that. That's the picture of Mark's gospel. And next week I'm going to talk about why I believe John the Baptist opens the story. Think about that. Mark, and I'll talk about this more next week. That's not in my notes. I need to move on. But Mark doesn't tell us about the birth, right? Luke and Matthew tell us genealogy and the wonderful Christmas story. Mark says, you know what? John the Baptist. And I'm going to talk more about why he does that, but it's encased in this idea that Jesus came to deliver Israel from their enemies. It's a stern view, a more stern view of Jesus. Okay, back to my notes. I apologize. I don't have my timer on today. I've had a break. You have to cut me a little slack. The The earliest Christian tradition about Mark's gospel comes to us from citations made by early writers quoting a man named Papias. Anybody ever heard of Papias? I know Richard has. We call them the fragments of Papias.
I've heard of it.
That was for the camera.
It's a good-looking cup, isn't it?
Papias was a late first century Christian leader, and he claims, and all scholars believe him, he claims to have known John the Apostle and many of the other famous leaders who lived towards the end of the first century. He wrote a 5-volume book titled An Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord. It could be, I've never heard a scholar argue this, but it could be that exposition of Papias, no, that's impossible, because he lived after the gospel writers. Forget it. That's why no one knows. But wouldn't you like, we don't have that document. An exposition of the sayings of the Lord is gone. We have early writers who quote from it. The guy that I studied, Clement of Alexandria, quotes from it. And they're very interesting stories that are not contained anywhere else. But that 5-volume set is gone. It got lost. It was destroyed. We don't know what happened to it. But in that tradition by Papias, he tells us that Mark's gospel was the first one written. He records that Mark initially preached the gospel along with Barnabas. Everybody remember Barnabas? He's the one that traveled with Paul initially, and then Peter and Paul come into conflict, and then Paul, if you read the first 2 chapters of Galatians, Paul talks about even Barnabas was led astray. And then we have in the book of Acts where Barnabas and Paul part ways, and scholars have debated why did they part ways, and some scholars, and I would be one of them, believe it was over the Gentile issue, and Barnabas just didn't like Paul being so obstinate against the Jewish leadership of Peter and James. But it's at this point that Papias says John Mark meets up with Barnabas, and the book of Acts says they sailed to Cyprus. And what Papias says is they went on to Egypt, where they preached the gospel. They were the first ones to preach the gospel in Egypt. Then Papias tells us that Mark writes down his notes for what he calls his story or life of Jesus. And then when Peter is arrested by Nero in Rome and is sitting in prison waiting for his execution, Papias says that Mark ventured to Rome with his notes and interviewed Peter, talked with Peter, and read him his notes. And Peter made corrections and said, well, you're missing this, or you should say that. And so Papias tells us that Mark takes his notes from Peter, and then he compiles his gospel that we call the Gospel of Mark. What's interesting, I think all this is interesting. I'm probably boring some of you, and I apologize. All of this will make better sense as we study through the gospel. I will tie some of the historic importance into the text. Mark uses early Aramaic sources. So does Matthew and Luke. In fact, whatever document Matthew and Luke had that Mark did not have, we're almost positive was Aramaic. Everybody knows what Aramaic is, right? It's a dialect of Hebrew that the Jews spoke on a daily basis. Hebrew was only really spoken in the synagogue or in the temple. And so their daily life is kind of like Southern. They spoke Southern in Palestine. And so these early Aramaic sources that Mark has, he then does something some of the other gospel, Matthew and Luke follow him, and that's part of why we know they had his text. But Mark adds Latin phrases from time to time. Now we can't see it because in English translation they don't always note it. but he mixes Latin phrases in, especially geographical things. That helps us to believe that Mark is writing, if you think about that it's the life of Jesus styled after Julius Caesar, and he has Latin in it, and he traveled to Rome to see Peter, it leads us to believe that his audience, his original audience, is probably Roman. And he's writing this thing to try to get Romans to listen and hear this amazing story of Jesus. Now, I find that incredibly exciting because it's an early witness. You know, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. Mark's gospel was like targeted to the Roman Gentile. And I just find that exciting. Now, in addition to that, Mark, we learn from the book of Acts and Paul's letters, Mark traveled with Paul. Paul asks for Mark in Colossians and Philemon. And so we have this thread. When I think of Mark, I think of a young man. We think he was a young man. He wasn't one of the apostles, but he was related to Jesus like a second cousin, if I'm right. I can't, this is not my notes. I think he was like a second cousin. This should make Lillian happy to hear about second and third cousin. But John Mark was a very young man, and he knew Jesus, and he knew some of the apostles, but he ended up traveling with Paul. Then he became a friend with Barnabas, and then he went and interviews Peter, who he probably had known while Jesus traveled with the disciples. And so here we have this guy writing the first account. Now, I'm going to tell you that, and we all would believe this, he's not an eyewitness, but he's getting his information from eyewitnesses. And he's telling the Romans this life of Jesus. So I'm going to read and teach. And I also want to bring another interesting dynamic in. In my reading, the one main scholar that I'm reading who, I like him. He's a good scholar. And I read in him that Mark's gospel was neglected in early Christian history. Actually, he maintains that Mark's gospel was neglected until the last 100 years. And I found that interesting. Why is that interesting to you? Because I've never taught through Mark. I've taught through Matthew more than once. I've taught through Luke. Luke is my favorite gospel. I've always, in my own heart and mind, not openly, but have diminished Mark's gospel. Why? Because it's short. Matthew and Luke have all this other stuff. And so I've always viewed Luke's as more fleshed out. And so I personally have neglected Mark's gospel. So when I read that it's been neglected in church history, it reminds me that the guy I studied, who was writing around the year 200, hardly ever quotes from Mark. And I always found myself, why didn't he quote from Mark? He quotes from Matthew and Luke all the time. And I believe it's because after the other gospels were written, they had more information, and so the tendency is to think that Mark's is not as... Help me out, Dave. Not as good. Not as thorough. Doesn't give us as much detail. And yet it's the first one written. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to read, and that's what I've been doing. I've been trying to read Mark, because my history has always been, when I teach from one of the synoptic gospels and I'm on a story like a parable, I'll check the other synoptic gospels to help me understand it. And I'm not going to do that, you guys. I'm reading Mark, and I'm trying my best to read Mark as if Matthew, Luke, and John do not exist. Because I want Mark to speak to me. I want to read Mark like he intended me to read him, rather than reading. Some of you have heard me say that as Christians, what we've been taught to do is take all the New Testament and put it in a blender and hit the blend button and then drink a Christian shake. When we do that, we lose the significance of the individual writings. Because every single writing in the New Testament stood alone. Any of the gospel, well, okay, Matthew and Luke had Mark in front of them. But as I just said, they added to it. They didn't just take Mark. And so what I'm trying to do is read Mark again for the first time. And to try my best to read him as the earliest reader would have done. And I've already had things open up to me that I've never thought about. Open up to me that I've never heard anyone else say. And of course, my methodology when I have one of these voila moments is I think, okay, I don't want to say this in church if I'm the outlier, if it's just me. And so I go and check scholarly sources and they say it. And then I feel confident that I can say these things, right? But for me, it's been exciting already. And Abby and I talked about, what do we want to study next? Abby's teaching with us now. And, I'm hoping you're going to do some of Mark. Are you going to?
Sure.
Okay. And I think I told Abby that I wasn't real excited. Didn't I say something like that? Yeah, I've never been real. And now I'm jazzed. I'm pumped up. I love Mark already. So I'm hoping to inculcate in you a love of the gospel material again. So, as we go, I might say something sitting here that you think in your mind, if you know the scriptures well, you might think, oh, no, wait a minute, Al, that's not right because Matthew or Luke said blah, blah, blah. Trust me, I know Matthew and Luke, okay? And I may say things that you immediately are going to think, well, wait a minute. He's forgetting these other, I'm doing this on purpose. I'm trying to hear it for the first time as if there are no other writings for me to check. Does that make sense? So, now, what's going to happen, I think, is that we're going to grapple with some of the things Mark says, and if we are true to what I just said, and we don't go and check other things, and we don't go back and go, oh, well, these are all the things that I've heard all my life in church, so it cannot. If we don't do that, it's going to leave us to grapple with things that we're not sure of. And I want to encourage you to do that with me. Okay? God's not offended by this. Okay? When we wrestle with things that we've always taken for granted, let's think. Let's get outside the box. I mean, what I'm going to share next week about John the Baptist, I've never heard anyone say. I've never read it in another scholar until I wanted to make sure I wasn't the outlier, and I read Ben Witherington, the scholar I love, and he says the same thing, and then I went, why have I never heard this? So you're going to hear things you've never heard. Please don't, don't stone me. And don't report me to the Assemblies of God. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Nothing's going to be bizarre, I think. Now, this is my last statement, if I use one of the other Gospels, please don't call me out, okay? After I just said everything I said, I may reference something one of the other Gospel writers said to make a point that I think is really important. So please don't rebuke me if I do that. I'm done. How long was that? Was that bad?
So,
Questions and comments?
what I read about while you were talking, is that Mark was a cousin of Barnabas. And that's why he leaned towards him more than Paul. But then it also talks about in 1 Peter, where when Peter was talking to the Romans, Babylon, and all that, and he was talking about things, he also talked about Mark in there. So Mark's kind of like side B of a record. He was in the inner circle, and he's getting it from Peter. Now, obviously Paul got it another way, directly.
Yeah. Paul was a little bit different.
Right,
yeah.
but he got it from Peter, and who else was as close to Jesus as Peter, right?
Right.
And,
And Paul got some of what he believed from Peter because he spent 15 days with him.
right.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you for reminding us that he's a cousin to Barnabas. I forgot that. I couldn't remember who he was a cousin to.
so everybody, I mean, there were 70 people that went out, right? So not everybody has some different purposes. Just like, when I share Christ with somebody is different than if someone else shares.
That's right.
So
That's right.
he was chosen to,
That's right.
to speak to the body.
That's right. And along those lines, if we had a story, I mean, we already have a bunch of stories from this church. I've been here 3 years, and if I told a story that a bunch of us had in common, trust me, Lillian or Saran would go, no, you left out this and that. And, and Lillian would want to say, well, yeah, but you didn't tell him that the second cousin was married to... And that's what the gospel writers do. And that's a big reason why Matthew and Luke, they had things that Mark apparently didn't have. So, good. Very good. Anybody else? Question, comment?
I was just talking about that and the way he wrote. When you were talking about the ands. It just, to me, is like he doesn't want to give you a place to pause and stop.
That's right.
He wants you to read the whole thing. And maybe, I was thinking, that's why he made it short. Get rid, some writers like a lot of detail and he wasn't that. He said he wanted to get the story and the point.
That's right.
And he wanted somebody to sit down and read the whole way through and not go, oh, I can stop here and come back. No, he wanted to keep their attention, and the and is like, you can't stop here, you have to keep going.
That's right.
Keep going, keep reading till you get to the end.
Like reading, some of us have read a novel or something and you just can't hardly put it down. And you're exactly right. Thank you for saying that, because I was not following my notes and I forgot to say that. However, I also want to, never mind, I can't remember what I was going to say. Saran.
Well, and also, I think it kind of opened my eyes a little bit into a little bit of maybe Mark's personality, because we have, even in our church here, we have different storytellers and different types of storytellers. I tell a very long story for those of you that don't know, and my stories are fun. But Mark is a very to-the-point kind of guy. He has a very matter-of-fact attitude about telling the story.
Right.
He doesn't need to tell you what the weather was like or any of that stuff. He's just...
Right, and I just remember what I was going to say that Dana reminded me of. Please let me say it now.
That's all I got to say.
Many of you have heard me say over and over again that the New Testament was mainly written to illiterate people, right? In the early world, only in a large metropolitan city you would have 5% who can read and write. Outside the major metropolitan, it was down into the 1.5% to 2% are literate. So everyone else has to have things read to them, and yet Mark apparently is written to be read.
Yeah.
And I tell you, it's completely revolutionized the way I'm going to read him, because I've always resisted when I read scholars say that he used rhetoric and used literary device. I would always go, you know what, that's ridiculous. He's not that well educated. Mark uses very simple Greek, which, just very simple Greek. And I always thought, no, he's just not that educated. And I've changed my mind on
Well, wouldn't that simple Greek be for the Roman, wouldn't that have been a common...
Well, no, it's probably because his first language is not Greek. But the point being that I've changed my mind on this because of everything that you said and everything I've been reading. He wrote this to be read by educated people, I think, in Rome. It's the gospel in Rome. I just think it's cool. And if all of our history lines up, Paul is probably now imprisoned in Rome when he releases his gospel. So there's just a cool dynamic to me. But thank you, both of you. Those are good comments. Anybody else? Question, comment? Okay. Anybody going to start reading Mark with me? Cool. Cool. It's going to be good. It's going to be good because actually, Jesus is who Mark. He is a man of power. I mean, he's confronting the power structures and he's going around doing mighty works. And that's what we're going to be reading about. And it's, it's going to be good. So let's stand and we'll be dismissed. Leo, you jumped up so fast. Can you pray and dismiss us? Would you mind?
Sure thing.
Cool. Leo, a good Latin name, by the way.
God, thank you for this time we've got to come together. Thank you for Al's passion for your word. I pray that it rubs off on every single one of us, that we find a new love and excitement for the gospel that we spend so much time on. Oftentimes it feels oversaturated and we can take it for granted, Lord, but your story should never be taken for granted. Father, I pray that we would all learn together and that we would all move forward together and that we would all seek you together and we would all seek a deeper understanding of you. Lord, I give you praise for this church in general. Lord, I just thank you for being here in the midst of our worship, in the midst of our jokes, in the midst of just our learning. God, I pray that we would all walk away from here feeling refreshed and revitalized and ready to seek after you with all of our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Hallelujah.
That was great, Leo. You need to do that more often.
I know, right?